Everybody. We're going to start our last hour of the Fall Festival. And just another reminder to let everybody know that you will be muted and to please put your questions in the Q&A. To wrap up the day, the Master Food Preservers will be presenting what to do with all that winter squash. Everything you ever wanted to know. During this class, you will learn tips and tricks on preserving, cooking, and enjoy your winter squash. This presentation will start with information about Master Food Preservers from Nellie, Oehler, followed by their video on winter squash. We will be stopping the video between each presenter and at the conclusion of the video for questions and answers. There'll be lots of time for question and answers. They have several handouts and we will put the link to them in the chat box and we will be sending them out as attachments in a follow-up email. During the video, you will be introduced to Ginnie Grilley. Ginnie is a lover of all things squash, a master food preserver since 2015. Her favorite squash is curry, a Hubbard variant. Next will be Nellie Oehler. Nellie is the OSU Extension Faculty Coordinator of the Lane County Master Food Preserver Program for the past 40 years. She loves to preserve most of her own foods, grows a big garden, and raises sheep on her small farm in Corvallis. Last will be Celeste Percy. Celeste is an avid master food preserver and fiber artist from Eugene. She loves to cook and sew, and she has made over 500 masks since the pandemic began. So here's Nellie to say a few words about the master food preservers before we start their video.
Okay, we're very happy to be here today. I hope you can all hear me. This is a new adventure for the Master Food Preservers. I know Master Gardeners have been doing a lot of this video conferencings, but we have not been that talented. So you're going to get our very first production, and I think you will enjoy it. I'm the coordinator of the Master Food Preserver program. I started the program in 1980 and 1980. In 1981, I became the coordinator in Lane County, and we've been the strongest Master Food Preserver program in the state. We're actually part of Oregon State University Family Community Health Program. We emphasize food preservation and food safety, and I can actually say my volunteers are probably better prepared for winter and disasters than anybody else in Lane County because their freezers and their cupboards are full, and we're going to share a lot of wonderful things with you. We're also posting a lot of our stuff on our Facebook pages and our website, so you can get weekly tips from our Master Food Preservers, and hopefully we'll be doing some more of the video little clippets throughout the winter. So we're going to start. We actually have ours in a movie form, and it was kind of fun because Ginnie turned hers in, I turned mine in, and Celeste turned hers in, and then my grandson kind of put it all together in a little program for you. Because it's long, we're going to stop each segment. So if you have questions, just post them in your question and answers, and we will do kind of each segment and then cover everything at the end. So enjoy our program, and I'm hoping that Jan will have share a screen for us.
Okay, yes, I will.
And speakers are both on because it plays out of the speakers and then goes into the microphone.
You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Hey, Jan.
There's nothing I can do unless you're the host and the one playing it.
We don't even know our number.
Squash, they'll last for, I don't know, 2 to 3 months in storage, but then they're going to rot. Hi, my name is Ginnie, and I'm here today to talk to you about the different kinds of winter squash that are out there. How do you tell when they're ripe? And then how do you store them for eating later during the winter when you're looking for some fresh produce? So, unlike summer squash, winter squash are those that have very hard skins where the seeds are fully mature. Now, you can't dent them with your fingernail. They have very hard skin, which is one reason why they last so long. They're full of antioxidants and vitamins, so very nutritious. You can go ahead and prepare them for both savory and sweet recipes. There's lots of different kinds of winter squash out there. I've got some varieties here. This is a spaghetti squash. This is an acorn squash, very common in the markets today. This is itty bitty butternut squash. They're usually much bigger, but this was just a tiny one that I had. This is a buttercup squash. This has a little dimple on the bottom and has deep orange, dry, sweet flesh. I really like it. This is a type of Hubbard squash, which is known as a curry. And the nice thing about this one is that you can eat the skin. So it stays its shape when you're making soups and stews. And then this is a Tetsu Kabuto type of squash called an iron helmet. And I'll talk more about that later. So all winter squash, they are ripe when the stalk itself starts turning corky and you can't press it, can't dent it with your fingernail. Usually the skin starts to turn kind of a dull, dry color versus shiny. So that's how you tell when your winter squash is ripe. One thing you don't want to do is leave your winter squash out there when it freezes, because once it freezes, it may go ahead and accelerate the rotting of your squash, and you don't want that. So you need to harvest it before it freezes outside. So once you've gone ahead and harvested your winter squash, you want to go ahead and leave it in the sun at either 75 to 85 degrees for a couple of weeks to let the skin harden further and the seeds mature fully. That's called curing. And when you're done with curing, you want to store your winter squash in a cool, dark spot that has air circulation and check it frequently to make sure none are rotted. Now, some winter squash rot faster than others. The spaghetti squash and the acorn squash, they'll last for, 2 to 3 months in storage, but then they're going to rot and it's not going to be any good. The butternut like this one can last 4 to 6 months in storage. And these two, the buttercup and the curry squash, will last easily 6 months. Studies done at Oregon State University were looking for what kind of winter squash lasts the longest, and they came up with one. This is the Tetsu Kabucha. It's a winter squash that came from Japan, and they used these squash to feed themselves after World War II. So it's a very durable squash. The studies at OSU says that these can remain good and tasty for more than 12 months. So they're a great addition to your garden, should you like winter squash. So that's the kind of winter squash that we have. You've learned how to identify how do they get ripe and how to store them, what types store best, and we'll move on to our next segment.
So we'll take any questions that you might have. You can put them in the Q&A. Apparently I can't mute myself and you can't hear the video unless so I apologize.
I noticed, Jan, that the sound is different. It's not synchronizing with the talking. I don't know if you hit something.
I will try that next time I pull that up.
Okay.
Does it help if you wrap the squash, like for example, in a newspaper? Jenny, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, you can certainly do that. And I think it would help. It really helps if you have good air circulation. So I tend to put my squash in boxes on the floor of my garage, and there's not a lot of air circulation in that. So wrapping them in newspaper helps them avoid touching each other. And then you can isolate the one that's rotting and notice it easier if you wrap them in newspaper.
What temperature and humidity is best for storing?
Temperature certainly above freezing. I really don't know below what temperature. You probably don't want it very hot, like next to your freezer or anything like that. Humidity as dry as you can get it.
How long will delicate squash last in storage?
Oh, I'd say maybe 2 months at the most. They're one of the quickest of they're thinner skinned, so they're one of the quickest to start rotting.
The Peruvian squash some of us raised this year seemed to be a winter squash. How long does that one last?
I don't know what Peruvian squash you're talking about.
Okay, we'll ask, that's Steve Marks. Maybe he can give us some more information.
To remember too, when you're storing your squashes, don't store them with your apples, because they put off ethylene gas and they will mature a lot faster with storing apples. And I know people are storing apples right now, so separate the apples and the squash and potatoes and everything else in different bins. There's some good information on our website on root cellaring that you might want to go on if you're going to store these.
Can you get the squash to ripen off the vine?
I wouldn't really know about that. I've gone ahead and eaten, like right now I'm harvesting the last of my winter squash and it's probably not ripe. And so what I find is the seeds are immature and the flesh is a little more stringy. I don't think it will ever mature unless it's ripe from the vine, but I could be wrong.
Is it okay to store the squash on a wire shelf with a tarp covering the shelf racks to keep it dark?
Sure, great idea. Except you want the air circulation too. So you want to lift up that tarp and flap it around a few times every week just to get the air circulating.
I grew an unknown winter squash from a neighbor. How can I tell if it's edible or just a giant gourd? It's hard, but looks like a giant, big, fat, yellowish zucchini.
Well, I just say cut it open. I mean, and eat it. See if it tastes good. You're probably not going to get sick from it. So it might not taste. One time I had what I thought was a perfect delicata, and it turned out to be some sort of melon, and it was still tasty, but it looked funny. So I'd say try it.
Okay. how long, I'll probably butcher the name of this, but how long does trumpet, rapicante, zucchini, squash last in storage?
Sorry, anybody else? I don't know the answer to that.
Rapicante, zucchini, squash, anybody?
I have no idea. I'm not an expert on mini squashes. I just store them and then see what happens. And if you start seeing some deterioration, eat them right away. But I had some delicata squash I was eating in March. So I guess it all depends on the squash and where you're storing them. So there isn't an exact time for each one. A lot of it is where you store it, how cool it is, how dark, the location, and how well it was hardened off in the garden. So it's not an exact science. But the thicker the skinned ones will probably last a lot longer than the thinner skinned ones. Oh, Pat just said, what did Pat just say? She just sent a note. She's our expert, but I lost the note.
Yeah, she said they held up well for me last year.
Okay, that's good. Patterson knows everything about squash. She's our root celery expert. Okay, I think we'll move on and then we'll have more questions at the end. How would that be?
Close these. Let's see if I can get it share again. Share my screen.
Hi, my name is Nellie Oehler, and I'm the faculty person in charge of the Master Fruit Preserver program in Lane County, and we're happy today to tell you some more about pumpkins and squash. Jenny showed you all the different kinds of squash and pumpkins she grew in her garden and how to tell if they were ready, and I'm going to show you how to get them ready to preserve. So one of the biggest problems we have with winter squash is that if you cure them right, they have a very hard shell, and it's very hard to get into it. So Ginnie and Celeste and I were talking, and Celeste says, well, I use a potato peeler, and I just meticulously take and peel off the skin. Well, this squash right here is a little tough, and they all are, so it's going to take you a little while to do that. I don't know what this is, but it grew in my garden. It looks like it's a cross between a round zucchini and a pumpkin, but it's got a really hard shell, and I grew them last year, and they kept for several months. My very favorite one, of course, is the red warty pumpkin. It has really orange skin in it, and I like this one for freezing and making soups out of it, and also eating fresh and making leathers and that sort of thing. Jenny says her favorite way to do things is to take a nice chef knife, and she takes a mallet. I use a hammer, and it's kind of hard on your knife, but if you have an old one, it works really good. And then just pound this thing in here, and you can do that too. That's one way to do it, but it takes you a little while to get that done, but it also works pretty well, but you got to be careful. Another way, of course, is to just clean off the wood hatchet, and we can go outside and I can show you, you can take this and it works pretty good on there, but I'm also going to show you my very favorite way to open up one of these really hard winter squashes. So we're going to move outdoors and I'm going to show you how I do mine. Okay, for your harder squash, one of the ways I like to do it is get yourself a nice hatchet and wash it up. Put your pumpkin or squash on a chopping block and boom! Oops! May take 2 times, but there, it comes into pieces. And then you can just break it apart. And you're ready to go. Like that. But my all-time favorite, when you got these big squash that are really hard, just put down a tablecloth or a bed sheet and just smash it on the sidewalk. And take out all your energies, and look how easy that is. Boom! And you've got pieces of squash. Now you can take these inside and we'll show you what to do with them. Okay, now that we have our pumpkin cut into pieces, we have to cook it. So the first thing we need to do is to take out some of the seeds that are in there. So I use a very sharp or big spoon that's easy to control and scoop out the seeds. Once the seeds are out, then we can put a little bit of water into our pumpkin, cover it with plastic wrap, and we can cook it in the microwave. Or you can put it in a roasting pan and do it in the oven. Some people like to do it in a crock pot. So whatever your preferred method is good. If it's a small squash, like an acorn or a butternut, you can just stab them with your butcher knife to get some holes in them. And then put them in the microwave for about 3 to 4 minutes, and then you can cut them open, take out the seeds, and continue with what you want to do with it. If you're doing spaghetti squash and you're doing them in the microwave, make sure you cut those in half before you put them in, because they do blow up in the microwave and they do make a mess. The other thing that I like to do with my pureed pumpkin is to make it into leathers, like fruit leathers. And this is the pumpkin, just plain pumpkin leather, and it just hasn't anything in it except pumpkin or squash. And it gets quite crispy, and you can actually grind that up, and you can add it to your lattes, or you can add it to soup as an added ingredient to thicken it a little bit. But my favorite is the pumpkin pie leather, and this one kind of separated a little bit because the puree was a little thin. I sometimes add applesauce to it, and you get much more leather-like leather that way, and it has the pumpkin pie spices in it, little brown sugar, little honey, whatever you'd like. We do have a recipe that we posted on the chat in the pumpkin favorites. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to show you how to can winter squash and pumpkin. And this is really the only safety issue that we have with pumpkins and squash, because if you don't can it properly, you could risk getting botulism poisoning, and we don't want to do that. There's some excellent resources that you can go on our website. You can download the website, or you get a Canning Vegetables, which is P&W 172, and it has all the information about canning squash. The other thing is, if you don't have the canning app on your phone, there's a canning app that Oregon State University has that leads you through all the canning processes for fruits and vegetables and pickles and all that. So you could use the canning app to guide you as you're canning. Now, with pumpkins and squash, because it's so dense, we have to can it in chunks, and we can't can it as a puree like you buy it commercially. But if you can it, once you open the jar, you drain off the liquid, and you can turn it into a puree very easily if you want to use it in a pie or as a side dish that way. The other caution that I want to give you is that we do not have any recommendations for canning spaghetti squash, because it becomes too dense because of the spaghetti-like texture of that squash. But all the other winter squashes and pumpkins can really well. So we're going to can them in chunks, and I'm going to kind of walk you through this and show you what to do. So first of all, you want to chunk your squash. So I have peeled some squash, and I have some slices here, and we're going to take and we're going to make about a 1-inch, 2-inch chunk. So we're just going to chunk this squash, and they don't have to be exactly even, but just make them into squash chunks so that they're not going to be too dense when you're going to can them. So once you get a pile of them chunked, you want to get some boiling water going here, and we're going to blanch them. And we're going to blanch them for 2 minutes. So I've already had my water boiling. I've blanched them for 2 minutes in here, and then you take them out and drain it. And then we're ready to pack the jars. You always want a nice hot jar. So we're going to can in a pressure canner. So if you have your water in the pressure canner already, you can keep your jars nice and hot in the canning water, and then bring it out, and then we're ready to fill our jars. Oops. We need a canning funnel. Works really, really nice. So you can put a canning funnel on your jar, and then you're going to take your hot squash, and we're going to fill the jars with our chunks of hot squash. Okay, now we don't want to get it too tight in here because we don't want it too dense. There's a 1-inch, there's a little line right under the ring here, and you can see it on your jar, and that's the 1-inch head space. So that's where we want to fill our squares of pumpkin. To that, So just about like that. You don't want to fill it too tight. Okay, so we'll put this back in here. And I've got a couple other jars that are just about ready to go too. 1 second here, we'll pull this over. We've got some jars ready to go here. This one can have just a couple more pieces in it. There, now the next step that we can do is we can add a little bit of salt. Okay, now our jars are full and we're ready to add some salt to them. Adding salt to the jars is an optional thing. However, adding a little bit of salt does enhance the flavor of your end product. But if you're on a salt-free diet or you want to add it later, you can do that. The recommendation is 1/2 teaspoon of salt per pint or 1 teaspoon per quart. But as I say, I usually don't do a whole 1/2 teaspoon, but I do add a little bit of salt to my canned food because I think in the long run, with it setting and all, it does taste better at the end, even if you're salting it when you're done with it. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to add some boiling water to this. And so I have some fresh water that I boiled here, and I am going to use that. Some people like to use the blanching water, but I think it gets a clearer product personally if you use some. And then again, you go to the 1-inch head space right there, which is that line. And so we're just going to fill our jars. It's really easy. Once you get a bunch of this done, you can figure out how many you want to can at one time, fill them all, and do one whole canner load. There. And after you fill them, the best thing to do is use a plastic picnic knife. You don't want to use a metal knife because it will etch the bottom of the jars and that will weaken them, and sometimes the bottoms will drop out of the jars while they're canning. So just take your picnic knife and just run it down the sides of the jar to remove all the air bubbles, and then kind of push on it and see if you're at the head space there. And I add just a little bit more water to that one, and then we'll do this one. Just run it there. That just kind of gets all the air out, and that way you will end up with a full jar and not a half full jar. There you go. Okay, the next one you want to do is take a damp cloth, and it can be a paper towel or a damp washcloth, and you want to wipe the rim so that there's no pumpkin on the rim of your jar. Like that. And then we take our lids, which we soak we just have them in water. It doesn't have to boil in water. The new lids, you just have to wet them down and then place them on your jars. And then we'll put the screw bands on, and the new directions are finger tight. So don't tighten them too tight, because if you do, you could get buckling because it has to vent, and then the jar, ring and the lid will actually buckle and have little creases in it. We get that call sometimes. Okay, now they're ready to put into your canner. So these are nice and hot and ready to go into the canner. So we're going to use a pressure canner here, and you want the water to be, because the jars are hot, you can have the water at about 180 degrees, and we have 2 inches of water, or 2 to 3 inches of water in the bottom, plus a rack in the bottom, you'll notice. And so we're going to put our jars in here, and if we had a whole canner load, you know, they can touch each other. We can fill the whole canner full, but right now I've just got the 3 jars that we're putting in there. So you can see how the water's in the canner. Now they're going to turn the burner on full bore once we get the lid on. Now we have to use a pressure canner, and I have a dial gauge canner, but I have converted it to a weighted gauge canner, so I'm going to go with the weight rather than the dial. So we'll want to make sure the ring is in good order, and on your canner it'll say open and close. So it says open here, and the lid will go on, and then I'll put it on, and now this is closed. Now I'm going to turn my burner on full bore, and it's going to bring this to a boil, and then it'll take a little bit of time, but probably in about 6, 7, 8 minutes, you're going to start seeing a flow of air coming out of here, and that's actually not steam. One lady says the steam never came out. If it's steaming, you're going to run the canner dry, but it's air coming out, and what we're doing is venting, a very important step, which is getting all the air out of the canner as well as out of the jar. And you can just stick your hand in here, don't go clear down, but it'll just be warm air. After that's 10 minutes of steaming, then you put your weight on. And this is a weighted gauge canner now. And so our weight is a 3-part weight. That's a 5 pound. The one ring is another 5, so that's 10 pounds. And at our elevation, that's all you need. If you were doing it in bend, you would put the second ring on. Okay, then you're gonna keep this on high, and pretty soon this is gonna start jiggling. Once it starts jiggling, that's when we're gonna start counting the 55 minutes for pints. And so then we want to regulate the burner so it's a gentle jiggle, not a jiggle like this because you'll burn the canner dry. So a gentle jiggle, it should jiggle for 55 minutes. If you have a gauge and it's tested, it should read at about 11 pounds, between 10.5 and 11 pounds. If you have a weighted gauge canner, you put a solid weight on here, and then you bring this up to 11 pounds of pressure, and then you start counting your processing time. Okay, so let's just pretend this has been jiggling and jiggling and jiggling, and 55 minutes is done. We're going to turn off our burner, remove it from the heat, and let it set until the pressure goes to 0. And there's no more, if you wiggle this, there's no more steam coming out. Then at the end of that, you can take off the weight. And if you have one of these canners that has the little narrow ring in here, I usually just crack the lid and then you wait 10 more minutes. That equalizes the temperature in the canner so that you get a better seal. And then at the end of 10 minutes, we can open the canner. Always take the lid away from you because there's a lot of steam, and we can remove the jars and put those on a towel to cool, and they should seal. And then after they're cool, ta-da, there you go. This is your canned squash, which is a really, really good convenience food in the wintertime. You can add it to soups, you can use it as a side dish, you can mash it and make a pumpkin pie or squash pie. It is very, very versatile, and I'm sure you will enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Celeste, and today I'm
Okay, let's see if we have any questions here for them. Let's see. Questions on, oh, here we go. Do you have to use a pressure canner for squash?
Yes, you do. That's the only safe way that you can can it is in chunks and in a pressure canner because it's a low acid food. It's also very starchy, so heat penetrates much slower than it does, you know, like if you were doing green beans. And botulism could be a huge issue, and you really don't want to get botulism. So if you're going to do it safely, you have to can it in chunks in a pressure canner.
Any other questions? Oh, here's one. Is the canning time of 55 minutes the same for a thinner skin squash as well?
I didn't catch that. Can you read it again?
Is the canning time of 55 minutes the same for a thinner skin squash as well?
That is for all winter squashes. We do not have research-based processing time for summer squash like zucchini. Zucchini squash and patty pan squash and those, patty pan squash, those we only recommend that you freeze them. However, we do have a mixture of tomato with zucchini squash if you want to can them. But by itself, they took that down because they did not have a research base for that. So if you see that posted on the internet, you know that it might not be safe.
Any other questions? All right. I guess we'll start the last one of the next section.
I'm going to be sharing with you how to preserve your winter squash by freezing. I will be covering prepping the squash for freezing, and then we'll also do how to roast the seeds and even something fun to do with the skins. So in order to prep your squash for freezing, you either have to fully cook it or blanch it. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with blanching, it's a process where you cook the food for a few minutes, literally 2, 3, 4 minutes, and then immediately plunge it into ice cold water so that it stops cooking. So having your ice cold water handy is very important in this process. All right, I'll start off by boiling. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm assuming that you already know how to boil water. If you did have a question about it, you can always call the Food Safety and Preservation Hotline. An MFP volunteer will be happy to answer any of your questions, even if it's just about boiling water. So the water is boiling, it's a rolling boil. You put your squash in, 2 minutes, and then you'll take it out, immediately plunge it into the ice cold water. After the squash is completely cooled, you're gonna take, I use a clean towel, you can use a paper towel. You take out your squash, dry out the excess water, and at this point you can peel it if you want to. But I will remind you that the peel is completely edible, so I'll leave that choice up to you. You can then cut up your squash any way you like. The next way of blanching is by steaming, and you would follow exactly the same things you did for boiling. The third method for blanching is microwaving, and the advantage to that is that you can put the whole squash in just like this. The only thing you have to do is vent it by poking holes in it, okay? Squash skins are pretty tough, so if you don't have a crazy fork like that, you can use a skinny knife or a paring knife and poke your holes, and then put the whole thing in the microwave. Times vary, so I would start at a minute and see how you go from there. A minute might even be enough. To fully cook your squash, you would use the same 3 methods: boiling, steaming, microwaving, except that you'll do it for longer. So boiling, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes, steaming the same, microwave, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. Again, times vary, so you'll have to do a little testing. There is one more method that you can cook your squash with, and of course that's oven roasting. It does take the longest amount of time, 45 minutes to an hour, but your reward for that is you can have a whole lot of extra flavor. Now you're probably wondering, when would I fully cook a squash and when would I just blanch it? Well, it's really going to be on the future use of your squash. If you're just going to use it for soups, stuffing ravioli, then fully cooking it and pureeing it is definitely the way to go. If you want to use the squash like in stir fry or as a side vegetable or have chunks in a salad, then you want to blanch it because you have a much firmer squash and it's easier to cut into big pieces. All right, let me show you some squash that I've fully cooked. And these 2 ideas I call meals ready to go, because you're going to prepare your meal complete like this. You'll freeze it, and then when you want to eat it, all you have to do is defrost and reheat it. This is a butternut squash. I did roast it in the oven. I made a simple stuffing. And I'm just going to leave it like this for freezing. If you want to have a sauce or a topping on that, you want to put that on after it's been reheated. Oh, and one other little trick. When you reheat it, make this little sling. After it's heated back up, it's easy to pull out without burning your fingers or smushing the squash. Here I have a spaghetti squash. And obviously you can put spaghetti sauce in there. And another fun thing is to make one meatball and then put sauce around that. But I just stuffed it with what I had. I did, however, put a little pesto over it, which makes it kind of cute. The other thing I want you to notice is that I cut the spaghetti sauce crosswise rather than lengthwise. And the reason is you get longer noodles. The noodles in the spaghetti squash actually grow in a spiral, not in strands. So this makes it really fun to have nice long strands of spaghetti squash noodles. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is a dessert, and it's a baked apple that I stuffed with the squash. Now the squash stuffing, you can add brown sugar, cinnamon, nuts, whatever you want. I just left it plain. And then I froze it just like that. When you're ready, defrost it in the refrigerator. After it's warmed, you're going to drizzle some honey on it. Oops. And I made this little sweet mix with the squash seeds. There's butterscotch chips, white chocolate chips, and some dried cranberries. So after you drizzle the honey, just take a little handful of this, sprinkle it over like that, and there you go. You have your nice little dessert. All right, you've prepped your squash by either cooking it fully. If you blanch, you can have your slices. You want to freeze them. And what I do is just like when you do fruit. Cut up your slices, put it in a baking sheet, and then completely freeze them. And then you can put them in your zippy bag or your airtight container. To puree the squash, well, you can use a food processor, you can use a blender, you can use a potato masher. This is some squash. I did a rough mash. And you can see here I left the skin on. This was an acorn squash. And it just makes it a little bit more colorful. Now, squash in a zippy bag is kind of lumpy. And in order to save space, what I'm going to do is flatten it. So that you end up with this. See this little thin, flat thing? It makes it easy to store, doesn't take up too much space. And all you do is fill up your zippy bag part way, and then you can smash it with your hand until it's a nice thinness. And you're going to freeze it like that. Again, you'll end up with a little flat thing of squash that takes up very little room. The same, I'm going to say, this is some spaghetti squash I put in a zippy bag. And I did the same thing. I flattened it so it's nice and thin. If you're freezing a bunch of stuff, you can layer it. So I have this. And then I'm going to use wax paper or parchment because you don't want it to stick. Don't use paper and don't use foil because it will stick to your stuff. That, I can layer that, put another wax paper layer so you can stack them up and freeze several at one time. Now, another way to freeze the squash is by using ice cube trays, which is handy if you need small portions like for baby food. Another way to freeze your squash is to use a muffin pan. And I use cupcake liners, and you just fill it with squash and freeze it, and then you have these little cupcakes of frozen squash. And I will show you, remember that little baked apple treat? I also put that in the muffin pan just to freeze it solid, and then I'll put it in a zippy bag. I also put the little wax paper so it wouldn't stick. Okay. You have prepared your squash. It's all pureed, cut up, and in the freezer, and you can be happy to know that you can pull squash out of your pantry anytime you want to make anything you want. The next part is the roasting the seeds, and all you do is clean up, all the stuff, the gunky stuff that's around the seeds, which by the way is also edible. And the gunky stuff around the seeds you can just throw in with your squash and puree it just like that. So you lay the seeds are dry, you lay them on a pan. I use a 400-degree oven, and it crisps, I'm gonna say about 10 minutes. Now I bet you're wondering why our squash seeds are white and the pumpkin seeds you buy in the store are green. The white is a shell that covers the little green seed inside. And commercial growers have a variety of squash. that grows the seeds without the covering. So it's just the inside that's green. The next part of the squash is the skin. And I did experiment, oh, can you see that? I did experiment with roasting the skin and also putting the skin in the dehydrator. I found that roasting was better, but roasting it with a little spray oil, it just kind of makes a nice little crunchy thing. You can use this as a garnish over your soup, or just as a little side crunchy, or eat them as little snacks. So that's pretty much it about roasting the seeds and the skins. Now, what to do with the seeds? Well, we made that little sweet mix for the apple with the butterscotch chips. Here's a little snack mix. You can just eat them just as is, and it's a very nutritious, tasty snack. One of my favorite things I like to do is, it's called the Everything Seed Mix. And it's just like the topping on Everything bagels. And it's really tasty and fun. Here's a little hamburger bun I threw some on. And remember our little squash meal's ready to go. You take this after it's heated up and sprinkle it on like that. It's great to have. It's the recipe will be down in the links. Oh, one last thing. Ta-da! You can use a squash seed and make pesto. So just replace the pine nuts with pumpkin seeds. And it's really tasty, it's nutty and buttery, and quick and easy, and you can freeze this too.
All right.
Any more questions? We have one short more section more to go. Okay, a few questions here. If using seeds for pesto, do you roast them first? You need to mute yourself, Celeste. Down in the left-hand corner.
Okay, yeah. Can you, yeah. You can roast them if you want to, but it's not necessary. That would just be a personal choice. I think roasting it would give it a little bit more of a deeper flavor. So that is a good suggestion.
Any other questions out there? So seeds without the white cover, what varieties do you recommend?
I don't know. That would be a gardening question. And I just found the information that that's what the commercial growers did, but they didn't mention what variety that is.
Any other questions? All right, I guess we will start the last segment here.
I'm back. So this is what the butternut nudie dough looks like after it's been in the refrigerator for about a half an hour. You can see it's still pretty dry. It's not very sticky. So this is the fun part and great fun to do with your children. So you just take some of the dough out and you roll it so it makes a snake. This is really fun to do with your children. Roll it and roll it. There's a little bit of flour on my cutting board, as you could see. You don't want to have too much, otherwise it'll affect the toughness of your pasta. So when it's rolled out about that, a little less than an inch, you just take a knife, you cut it into bite-sized pieces, just like that. This is going to be so good. Then you take these pieces and you toss them into salted boiling water. You see at the beginning they sink like a rock. And as they continue to cook, they will start floating. And once they're floated, they're done. So you can see it's trying to do its thing. There's one starting to float a little bit. This should take maybe 3 or 4 minutes, that's all. But once you have cooked your gnocchi, you can go ahead and remove it with a slotted spoon and then use it in any other pasta dish. You can add sauce to it. Personally, I like it best when it's just sauteed in butter with a leaf of sage in it and then served that way, because then the butternut taste really comes out. So enjoy your meal. This is delicious.
And one more quick idea just to end our show with is, if you want to have some fun for the grandkids while your pumpkins are still not hardened out, take a knife or something sharp and you can write Happy Halloween and the year or the child's name on it, and it will scar over and it'll be the hit of the garden.
Okay, thank you. That was great. Let's see if we have any questions here.
Patterson just came on, and she's our little expert, and she said that the variety of squash that doesn't have, that you were asking about, is Lady Godiva. Doesn't have the shell on the outside of the seeds of the seed. So if you wanted to grow that one. We want you to know that the recipes that Jenny was showing and all the ones that Celeste were showing are posted on the chat, and you can get those at the extension office. If if you can't download them, let the office know, and they can send those to you as attachments. And most of those are also on our website.
Well, there was a couple of questions left over from the very first segment. I'll ask those. I've heard that washing winter squash in mild bleach solution before storing to prevent molding is the way to go. Is that your experience?
Well, I did study up on that. It was a couple years ago, whether that light bleach solution would delay rotting. And there's no science-based recommendations around that as of a couple years ago. I have done that in the past and had the same, I had the same results whether I washed them with bleach or not.
I've had some sweet pumpkins still in the garden that are still beginning to turn orange. Will pumpkins and other squash continue to ripen after they are picked?
What do you think, Nellie?
Oh, I'm sure they continue to mature, once they're picked. But if you pick them too soon, they don't harden over, and so they're going to spoil a lot quicker. But you can certainly pick them and eat them, which I've been doing. I had some little pumpkins, and I knew they weren't ripe yet, but I needed some pumpkins for a recipe, so I used them. They're not quite as orange inside as they would be if they totally matured, but the taste, was okay. You just want to make sure they get good and hardened. So if you leave them out there, it's getting a little cooler now. When we had that nice hot weather, that was really nice. I actually have mine out on the patio on kind of the brick wall, just sitting there. They're away from the rain, and they're hardening over pretty good there.
One more. How long will Delica squash last in storage?
Well, from what I understand, they're the more thinner skinned, and usually they'll last 2 months at the most. But you heard earlier that Nellie in the presentation, she had one last for 4 to 6 months.
Yeah, I ate it in March. I was surprised. I thought, boy, I lost it in a box, and I found it, and it was actually quite good yet. So. And those the ones that keep for a long time, you would not believe how long they'll keep, are the round zucchinis. they really harden over, and I am amazed. They're actually very pretty in there, but they're not yellow inside. They're actually white inside, but they do taste pretty good. And I was still eating. I know I had those in the garden house until February, and they make a nice hard shell. They look like a green pumpkin with spots on them.
Cool.
So just one comment. I recently made pesto from pumpkin seeds and it was very good. So.
People just think pumpkins sometimes are only for pumpkin pie, but they're very nutritious, as Jenny said. And I add them to soup. I freeze quite a bit of my pumpkin, both as puree and as little squares. But just thickening up some soup, just dumping it in that adds a lot of nutrients to your soup, and it's kind of like adding mashed potatoes to something to thicken it, and it gives it a nice color. Tomato soup with a little pumpkin in it is really good.
Mm.
Think of it more as a vegetable, and many ways that you can eat it. It doesn't have to be eaten with brown sugar and and butter and the things that are not good for us, but it can be eaten as a side dish, and it's very nutritious for you.
Do you have a favorite pumpkin variety?
What was that?
Do you have a favorite pumpkin variety?
Well, my favorite is, I said, the red warty pumpkin, and it looks really funny. It's red, and it looks like it has warts all around the outside, but it's bright orange inside, and it's very sweet, and it's a really good keeper too. I did try the peanut one, and it was awful. I thought it didn't have a very. It was fun to grow. We did it at the school garden, and the kids were fascinated. It looks like peanuts on the outside, but the meat inside was not very good. But I like the red warty one, and it's a good keeper. But everybody has their own favorite squash. I'm anxious to try the one from Japan. I hear it's really, really good. And there's a really good webinar out of OSU on that variety of squash, which I watched. And it was also kind of funny because they actually have a butcher shop for how to cut up. I saw how to cut up pumpkin. They didn't use my method, but they were teaching people commercially how to cut up pumpkins. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And they called it a butcher school for pumpkins.
Do you take the shells off the pumpkin seeds before using them?
You don't have to, but you can. I think it would be very laborious, and the covering it's sealed pretty tightly, so you would have to like wedge a knife or something. And if you wanted to do that, that's fine, but you still get the pumpkin seed flavor with the covering on.
Okay.
It's easier to get the seed out of it if you roast them until they're crispy, and then you can take your finger and actually squish them.
Hard to answer this, but I'll ask this question. Are there any kinds of pumpkins that don't taste good? I always thought the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins might not taste good.
I think the jack-o'-lanterns have quite as much flavor in it, but when we do them with the kids at school, we take the eyes and the mouth and everything, and we cut those up and we cook them up for the kids and made pumpkin leather out of them, and they gobble them up. So each person has their own taste, and I think they're nutritious and they cook up well. So when your kids are carving pumpkins for Halloween, don't throw those things away. You can cook the eyes and the mouth and the ears and whatever and give them a treat. I think they taste pretty good myself because I doctor them up, but I don't know what you and Ginnie and Celeste think. But
Well, I haven't cooked them, but I have been reading a lot about winter squash, and what I understood is the kind that the sugar pumpkins are designed for eating, and they're sweeter. But boy, I just like all winter squash. I think I'd eat the jack-o'-lantern too if I had it.
it's actually kind of funny. We were talking about apples, and when I was growing up, the Red Delicious apples, oh my gosh, we would save our money to go to the store to buy a Red Delicious apple. And I can't even give my Red Delicious apples away, and they're the old-fashioned Red Delicious apples. And so our tastes have changed, and I think we used to have one variety of pumpkin. Now we have hundreds of varieties of pumpkins and squash. So everybody likes their own variety, but they all are nutritious and will cook up.
Well, that seems to to the last question, and it's 3 o'clock. So anyway, so I'd like to hope everybody enjoyed the Fall Festival, and thank you from the Lane County Master Gardeners and the Master Food Preservers for joining us today. So stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Jan.
Mhm. Okay.